Are you jealous of my acrobatic Barbie? Because I would be. Hi, I'm Maria, and this is Oz Costumes, and today I will be showing my process on creating Raphtalia's tail. Believe it or not, this is my first fur tail, and it is actually a super simple project that any beginner could take on. If you want to hear special pro tips, make sure to watch the whole video. Now, let's get into it. My pattern for this project incorporated S-curves because I thought it would be more visually appealing. And just as a note, you can do a mock-up with something as simple as muslin just to make sure your shape works. Once I was satisfied and made the necessary pattern alterations, I cut my pattern pieces out of faux fur, making sure the fur grain line was going downward on the pattern because, you know, that's how animal tails are. Just a note, my patterns are all drafted without seam allowance. This allows me to trace on the stitching line itself onto fabric and cut the necessary seam allowances around them without marking them. I also trace one pattern piece at a time, flipping when necessary. I find that this method cuts time at the cutting table in half, and that pun is intended. And another tip, since we want the fur to go downward, you must absolutely resist the urge to nest your pattern pieces in this case. Cutting fur is probably the trickiest part of working with fur, and even then it is pretty easy to pick up. You just need some good sharp scissors. First, always cut with the fur facing down and make sure you're cutting just the layer that the fur is attached to, or what would be considered the skin. Then you slide your scissors along without closing the blades. Just leave them open and let the scissors slide. Doing this will ensure that you don't have any choppiness, and it will greatly reduce the amount of mess created when working with fur. Once my pieces were cut out, I pinned them together and stitched them, leaving the part that will eventually stick to my tushy open. I used fairly large stitches so that pulling the fur out from the seams would be easier when finished. Next was the painstaking task of turning everything inside out. Once that was done, I pulled the fur out of the seams using my fingers and a pick comb. My tail is starting to look more like a tail, but one thing Raphthalia has is a reddish tip that fades to the rest of the tail in a sort of ombre effect. So to do that, we're going to take this to the dye pot. Now, not all of us have fancy dye studios, and as much as I would like to say to avoid your kitchen at all costs, sometimes you have to dye there. Just make sure that there are towels covering surfaces and make sure kitchen utensils are out of the way, and for the love of all that's good, don't use your normal cooking pots. My thermometer actually wasn't working in this video, but a good rule of thumb for finding the right temperature is to get to the point where you start to see bubbles, but never get to a rolling boil. 180 degrees Fahrenheit is a good range to be in. This is my first time using RIT Dye More, which is specifically meant for synthetic fabrics, and since faux fur is basically plastic, I thought it would be a good choice. I used about half a bottle. If you're dyeing in the kitchen, stick to the liquid dyes. Powdered dyes are nice for creating specific color mixtures, but they can be extremely toxic and particles do tend to float. So please, just do liquid if you're dyeing in the kitchen. Once I was satisfied with the color of my swatches, it was time for the tail. For the ombre technique, it's basically just dipping one end of your fabric and slowly lifting it out of the pot. The longer you leave fabric in the dye, the darker it becomes. So as we pull the tail up, the tip will end up being the darkest. To get the color I wanted, I did this about 3 times. And just a note, when you dye things, the color will always look much darker than what it will be after it is rinsed and then dried, so keep that in mind. Since I didn't want to waste my dye bath, I went ahead and dyed the fabric that I will eventually use for Raphtalia's ears. And just a note, the hair follicles actually face up, unlike the tail. At least, that's how my fur baby's ears are, so that's what I did. For cleanup, I used a Tide Magic Eraser Sponge, and true to its name, it is indeed magic. I was satisfied with what I got, but one thing to note is the underside of the fabric took the dye much more than the actual fur itself. So if you plan on dyeing fur fabric, just keep that in mind. Since the tail was pretty ratty looking, I combed out the fibers to make it fluffy again. And to get the curls out of the fur created from the hot water that it was in, I went ahead and took it to the steamer, and this really rejuvenated the fabric. Finally, it was time to stuff the tail. I started with some polyfill and used a small dowel to push the stuffing to the tip. To avoid the tail from becoming too heavy, I actually used some stiff tulle netting as well. To attach the tail to my body, I decided to take some strapping that would fit around my waist with thick elastic at each end. Since I'm overlocking these pieces together, I'm pinning farther in. And for a pro tip, a method I learned to finish your overlock chains is to first pull at the chain to stretch it out, trim to make even, and then thread the chain onto a blunt upholstery thread and then pull it through the stitch. I did this on both sides and then trimmed the excess. When sewing on snaps or buttons or any such notion, you should always sew with a quadrupled thread. This means to thread your needle with 4 strands of threads essentially. It's much more stable and it will hold much longer. The snaps on the tail will attach to a square piece of muslin that is sewn on to the center back of the harness that I'm using. And the harness itself fits around my waist and attaches together with hooks and bars. Now the tail is ready! All I have to do is finish the rest of the costume, and I will be a Tanuki anime waifu warrior who happens to be best girl too. You know I'm right. If you liked this video and are interested in more cosplay related content, click the subscribe button and hit that notification bell. Like this video and tell me what you thought, and I will see you in the next video.